Okay, well, welcome to second episode or made recently of this The Void podcast. Today I am interviewing Chris Stylianou so that he can share his knowledge on. We're mainly going to talk about the global situation and more particularly the UK situation. In terms of both unity and education. And maybe we can throw in a bit of other subjects, but we'll see how the conversation goes.
We'll see. We'll see.
Hello, Chris. How are you?
Hello. I'm all right. Thank you, Moisey. How are you?
Yeah, good. So let's start by maybe taking the global view, and what's your position? What do you think the UK? What is the UK's position now that the Brexit has happened for the UK? Like, do you see it? Obviously, there's been talks of international trade deals, etc. What do you see the position as it is in now, and then maybe in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think, and this is going to be a classic. I study history, so this will be a classic historian's answer where I fence it a little bit. I think it very much depends in terms of how they play Brexit and how well they manage this process. And we're going to see really just how effective the leadership is within the UK. And the big thing which I can see coming up, which I think will be the first big determiner of whether or not it's possible for a Brexit Britain to thrive and survive in what is an increasingly globalized world, will be if it can maintain its unity. I think quite often, particularly people in England, don't think seriously enough about the ramifications of the United Kingdom's splitting apart. So, for example, currently, the UK is one of the only 5 countries who are permanent members in terms of the UN Security Council. But if the UK was to go and split apart, well, then could the UK realistically keep its seat at the table? It wouldn't be the UK anymore. It would be a best case England, Wales, maybe Northern Ireland. Can you really, for example, have the UK maintaining that? That is a significant question. However, conversely, I think we've seen with the successful vaccine rollout and the UK contributing so effectively to the AstraZeneca vaccine and other vaccines, and really demonstrating just, how it can be a world-leading member in terms of science, the potential positivity in terms of Brexit as well. So in answer to your question, as we move into the next 5 or 10 years, it will effectively come down to just how well can Britain manage to, first of all, keep itself together, because I think that will be essential. And then secondly, how can it meet the individual charges? And then thirdly, just how good is the quality of the UK's individual leadership as well. And the last thing, actually, which I should mention is, but we're going to have to sign a lot of trade deals. So that's something where the UK is going to have to go and adapt to that process before, they could be part of the European bloc. And I know they've signed some trade deals initially with Japan, etc., but they're going to have to go and adapt and train up a new generation of civil servants to cope and meet that demand as well. And the last thing on unity as well is that Britain is still quite a divided country on the kind of European matter as well. Who knows what that would come down to? So I think, in short, it's a little bit impossible to kind of know the full answer to that yet. But the big determiner and the big thing coming up isn't just the kind of vaccine rollout, because I do think Europe will sooner or later get its act together on that. But actually, the big thing coming up for the UK is going to be the Scottish question. Because sure, you can have a successful vaccine rollout, you can sign those initial kind of deals, but if the UK begins to fall apart, well, that's going to have serious ramifications.
Yes. And so there's been a rise in a lot of, even in Wales, for the deunifying or separating from England and the UK as a whole. So obviously the main contenders for these for separating is Scotland, and they have national elections. And what how because there's been the scandal of Nicola Sturgeon, which how do you see things playing out if in the next couple of years? Like, will they get a new referendum?
Yeah,
How will the SNP do in the next elections? Yeah, what's your thought?
I think everyone potentially thought that the coronavirus could be the thing out of nowhere which brings down the Johnson government. It currently looks like, due to the vaccine rollout, that will not be the case. But the thing which could be the Scottish factor, because if the Nationalists do secure a majority in the Scottish Parliament, it's very difficult to see how the UK government, within their lifetime of the current Scottish Parliament, could prevent there being a second referendum. They can bring up all the legal questions they want, but if the Nationalists win a majority, well, then there's a very strong democratic mandate to have that second referendum. I also think it's worth remembering and rewinding in terms of the fact that the situation is very different from 2014. I think it's important for people to understand that whichever side, and I am a unionist. I do want the union to come together, but I will accept that in 2014, the Scottish people, when they went to the polls on the referendum, thought when they voted to no to independence that they were doing so that one, obviously, the Scotland would remain within the European Union, but also let's not forget David Cameron made a vow in terms of more powers for the Scottish Parliament. Again, this is something which I think is very much well known and received within north of the border in Scotland, but less well kind of known south down in England, which is David Cameron later got sucked up in the 2015 referendum. He got sucked up in the 2016, the 2015 election, the 2016 Brexit referendum. He got swept up in all of that and didn't really fulfill his promise. Classic dodgy David Cameron. One of the UK's most slippery prime ministers, in my humble opinion, which we've had in our history, and he didn't really go and fulfill that, and that left quite a lot of bad feeling as well. So, looking at the history of this situation, looking at the current trajectory, if you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have said it's more likely that the Scots will vote a kind of nationalist majority, and a new referendum will be inevitable. However, the Sturgeon factor is a big curveball, which should have been a godsend for the Westminster parties. However, the Westminster parties were quite incapable. Both the Conservatives and Labour have recently gone through leadership change in terms of their Scottish Parliament as well. And I don't think there's really been a kind of solid voice to put the pressure that there should have been on Sturgeon. There's been some pressure, but not enough. And of course, recently in the independent inquiry, she was, I wouldn't say exonerated, because there were certainly serious questions about her behaviour, but nonetheless, there wasn't enough in there. The report cleared her to enough of extent that she can continue in her current role. So we'll see in terms of just to what extent mud has stuck on that one or mud has not stuck. Certainly, I don't think it reflects at all well on the SNP. But a big curveball that came out of nowhere was, of course, Alex Salmond's new party, the Alba Party. So the question with the Alba Party is this is going to go and split the nationalist vote, because in terms of the unionist vote, one problem is, of course, you've got the Lib Dems, the Conservatives, and you've got Labour. And often, for example, you see situations where, ironically, more Conservative voters will lend their vote to Labour to prevent the SNP, winning certain seats. So will that happen again? Or conversely, in Scotland's more proportional system, is this actually going to favour the nationalists and gain what Alex Salmond called a supermajority? So that is a big question as well. I think the most recent polls actually showed that the combination of the SNP and Alba were not necessarily split enough to prevent a nationalist majority. So if you ask me now, I'd say the nationalists are probably more likely to win a majority than not. And if they do win it, then a referendum will be unlikely. And it's not to say that the UK will definitely fall apart. We have to understand this within a chain, which is question one. Are the nationalists more likely to win a majority? I hope they don't, but I currently think that they are more likely to. And then secondly, if they do, what will happen in the referendum? I think it's currently split 50-50 on that as well. So this will tap a little bit more into what I'm going to go and say next. But I think if I was advising the UK government, I think they're going to have to get ahead of the curveball here. And as a country, we really should be kind of thinking in terms of looking at the structure of the UK. What does it currently mean? Does it need to be reformed? Because it hasn't really been looked at and reformed maybe enough over the last century or so.
Okay, so regarding those steps to for referendum, would an because I haven't seen the most recent poll, but I guess SNP is still in front of ALBA. So with SNP and nationalist majority, this happens. Obviously, Westminster has said categorically that they will not make any referendum compromise. It was a once-in-a-generation vote. Obviously, it's a bit too soon to count the new generation. Is there a way that the nationalists can then put pressure on Westminster? Or are we most likely to maybe see something similar than Catalonia, where there's an illegal referendum that is then bashed down by the central government, or any other form? What would be the next steps that might be possible, like different pathways?
Yeah, I think the Westminster government would have to tread very lightly whether or not you kind of agree in terms of this being a one-generation vote back in 2014, and therefore they have the ability to go and quash it. I mean, this is a Britain which wants to, I think it's important for it to maintain a positive global face. And if, for example, there was a nationalist majority and then they refused it, and then there was, if you want, an unofficial poll and it was voted for independence, and again this was rejected, well, that's not really a great look when you're trying to go and forge a new global future as well. So I think the question would be, if there is a nationalist majority, when would that independence vote happen? Now the SNP in this is where they could potentially overreach if they try and push for it too much in the short term. So clearly, you know, the Scotland, as well as the rest of the UK, has to recover from this COVID crisis. It's not just getting through the kind of worst of the virus itself. It's dealing with the immediate economic fallout and the transition back to normality. And about this is probably, you know, where the SNP and the ALBA Party, if they were to get a majority together, or if the SNP was to get that majority alone, would have to tread lightly in terms of maybe not pressing for it in the immediate couple of years. But the question would be, would they try and press for it in the immediate couple of years nonetheless? Or is there something where they would agree for it to be pushed much more into the long grass? Let's just say, you know, 2025, 2026 posed as potential reality. So when would this vote take place? Is this something which would take place very quickly? Or is this something which would go and take place much more in the long term? Intriguingly, actually, looking at the latest kind of round of support, polls, etc., it looks like the support and the most popular out option is more of a kind of long-term referendum once they've got through the worst of COVID. But it looks like the SNP are more keen upon a quicker poll upon this as well. But if you, again, the UK government, you might be more keen on that kind of long-term referendum as opposed to going and like having a quick referendum. And they might actually have a very valid point on that because perhaps, you know, the last thing which you really need is another kind of independence poll in the short term. But nonetheless, if there's a majority, it's hard to see how it can be prevented in the long term as well. There's also one other factor which I think should come into play. If we kind of reflect a little bit upon, you remember the 2017 election when May thought she was going to win a supermajority, ends up losing the majority as well. Sometimes in politics, and we'll see if that happens to the SNP, a party's just been in for too long and they ask too much from the electorate. And sometimes the electorates are wise enough to basically see, should we kind of reward this party for what is quite, you know, a blatant attempt to go and entrench themselves in power for years, or do you essentially clip its wings? And in 2017, May had her wings clipped badly. We saw many Conservative voters who were quite keen on Brexit actually going and switching their vote to other parties. to make a point to Theresa May. So is this a kind of thing where, you know, you'll have many Scottish voters who on balance might be a bit unsure about the future of the UK outside the EU, but equally are turned off by the shenanigans which are going on in the SNP and the split within Scottish nationalist politics as well, and therefore don't want to reward the nationalists with a supermajority, even if in the long term they think that independence might be attractive as well. So that would be quite interesting to see where those, I guess you call them swing voters, are going to go and put their vote, and will they prevent the SNP therefore from winning a majority as well. And then the last thing which I'd say is that can the new Conservative leaders and can the new Scottish Labour leader also get that act together in time as well? Because currently that's been, let's say, a failing. And the last thing is, what is the Westminster government going to do? One interesting part about this whole COVID situation has been that essentially, you know, you've seen the Welsh leader, the Scottish leaders, and the Northern Ireland leaders having their own briefings, having their own rules, essentially kind of, if you want, ruling their own kingdom. And Westminster hasn't been able to do too much about that due to the way that health priorities are split within the UK as well. So how does London react to this? Boris Johnson is the most popular man in Scotland. Nonetheless, he is the Prime Minister of the whole of the United Kingdom. So does he basically act like the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or does he take a bit more of a kind of back step and let the Scottish Conservatives and Scottish Labour run the show and try and prevent there being a nationalist majority as well? That will be a very interesting factor in all of this, because currently he's taken very much a back step. Will he now become more to the fore, or is he going to try and be a little bit more behind the scenes?
Yeah, like on this, like, do you think, apart from election-wise, is there anything Westminster should be doing to try and neutralise or at least convince Scottish voters not to back a referendum or to think again about independence? I think there's also, obviously, coronavirus has been dominating, but like Brexit has been happening in the meantime, and there's still the grace period. Maybe successes in that area, but maybe there's some other things that Westminster could do to sort of calm down the independent voters.
Yeah, it's this is again where I think David Cameron made a tremendous mess, etc., in terms of not honouring the kind of vow which he made to Scotland. There was a problem for two reasons. The first problem is that, and we've seen with the Northern Ireland kind of border, which is if you give one part of the UK special arrangements, that causes resentment in the rest of the UK. So English voters have a point, often will feel a bit more resentment when they look at the Barnett formula and they think Scotland gets more investment than many parts of England. Likewise, many Scots don't necessarily kind of like the fact that Northern Ireland is essentially going to receive a few privileges, let's say, of being directly on the European border, and they will look at that and they'll think, you know, okay, maybe we could have some more of that as well. So in terms of what the Westminster government can do, maybe the wisest kind of approach for them would be to try and look at this as a UK-wide issue. So not try and give special powers to Scotland, which could, for example, go and cause issues in Wales, and Welsh voters would have a point here. If Scotland's getting X, Y, and Z, why shouldn't Wales also have those financial benefits as well, just because they're the ones who are kicking up in terms of independence? However, again, you know, if you kind of live in Scotland, well, Westminster's it's a fair distance down. How many people in the current cabinet are actually from Scotland? I mean, Michael Gove kind of is, but he certainly, you know, his constituencies in Surrey. In many ways, he's probably seen as a bit more of a kind of voice for England than he is. It's not like in the kind of new Labour days when we had Gordon Brown as Prime Minister as well. So I think this will take a whole, if you want, UK-wide rethink, which is maybe not the perfect time to go and do this, but it's worth. And actually, I've been reading two interesting books, one from very different ends, let's say, of the political spectrum. One is written by Gavin Esler, recently came out, which is called How Britain Falls Apart. Gavin Esler former BBC Newsnight presenter as well, very much on the Remain side of the argument, Scottish by birth, but has spent much time working in London, and also Douglas Murray in terms of called The Strange Death of Europe. Very different ends of the political spectrum, but one thing which they both bring to the fore is a sense of kind of loss of the British identity. So, for example, many English people call themselves British, but they generally mean English. And actually, many English voters and English people identify more with being English than they do with British. Likewise, many Scots go and identify more with being Scottish than they do with being British. So what exactly is it now that is holding the UK together? In the past, the UK was held together due to the external threats, such as you look at World War II, you look at the threat of Napoleon before that, you look at, for example, in terms of the Cold War, that was what helped keep the UK together. What is now helping keep the UK together? Also, secondly, Johnson recently got in some trouble for saying devolution had been a disaster. And I think the kind of idea that, for example, there was purely a Westminster government probably is outdated, but you can kind of see his point, which is that once you go down that house, once you kind of have different parliaments, but you don't have an English parliament, invariably people will begin to identify more with the Scottish Parliament than they will the Westminster Parliament, which is fair enough. So should we also look at the structure of the UK? I would probably advise don't just, for example, do what David Cameron did to try and offer a bespoke deal to Scotland, but instead look at this from a kind of more wider British structure and actually be brave and bold enough to kind of ask the question, what is a British identity? What does it mean to be British in the 21st century? Answer that question, which is a difficult one first, and then secondly, maybe look at the structure of the UK. Should there be more local governance across the UK? Should you have certain cities being empowered more? Liverpool, for example, many people in that city identify much more with being Scouse than they do with being English. So therefore, should you kind of look at this holistically and say, okay, we're going to give more kind of influence, more powers to those local authorities and make the UK a much more federal system, which will go and appease people north of the border, and it will be a bit more kind of fitting to today's modern structure. That kind of debate we haven't really had enough of. Let's just say everything's been, I know there was, of course, you know, the kind of devolution deals under New Labour, but really that kind of big rethink of the UK structure we haven't really had as a political debate. And I think it's about time as well, because certainly I know many English people often do feel resentment as well. They think it's always about Scotland, which is being talked about, when in fact they themselves don't have much identity with London. So really, this is a kind of question which the UK should be asking itself. And it's a very deep, detailed and complex discussion and scenario to have. And that's where I have my reservations about the quality of the people in Westminster to go and deliver upon that as well. But maybe I'm being a little bit negative on that one. We shall see. So basically, that will be, I think, the smart way to do it. Don't just offer a bespoke deal to Scotland, but actually be brave and bold enough to have a kind of conversation in terms of what it now means to being Britain, what exactly should hold the UK together, and is it now the time to kind of revisit the overall structure of the UK and, for example, and put more of a federal system with more localised government in there as well?
Okay. Well, so you don't see any path to, would you see devolution being turned back and then relocalized in a different way, so break up and bring that in, like the recent scandals over the Liverpool Council,
Yes,
for example, could bring some backlash against that sort of more localized idea.
Yeah, you are right, and this is why I'm not kind of committing either way in terms of whether or not I think there should be more of a localized approach or not. I think there's pros and cons on that side, and you're right, there are often problems with localized governments, but nonetheless, I also think it's fair to say that many people in the UK and people in England don't feel a sense of identity with London. They don't feel a sense of identity with the kind of Westminster government and the current political system. And so therefore, there needs to be a kind of open conversation in terms of which direction do we go. The other way the Westminster government, of course, could play it is to say, no, the current system will stay in place. We'll have more, for example, regional mayors, and it will take a gamble in terms of which way Scotland votes, because it could just be, it's currently 50-50 roughly in the polls, that things are going well in the UK. The vaccine rollout has a good feel factor. And even if they do, for example, have a nationalist majority, in the end, the Scottish voters just about feel that it's just about better to be a part of Britain, which has a trade deal with Europe, as opposed to voting out. And if you want, taking a leap into uncertainty as well. But you can see potentially, Tom, where this is where my concerns lie, which is this is all very detailed, complex things with many a kind of right path, many a wrong path. And my concern is that looking at the quality of politician who we now have in Westminster, in my opinion at least, it's not the same quality that it was, if you want, 20 or 30 years before. And I'm not sure if they have the capability and the political judgment to kind of make the right calls on this. We shall see. I mean, Johnson is a lucky politician. So maybe, you know, this is where he's going to need some of that famous luck to get us out of that. And I think on this, time will tell.
Yeah, okay. I think last question to wrap it all sort of up. In a worst case scenario, if Scotland would manage to get a referendum, maybe in an illegal or in a legal way, both, how would you see reactions happen, and would you see then maybe Wales rising to some sort of independence for Northern Ireland, or would that be further deunification? Would there be some enforcement against to try and make this actually not happen, or how would you see it?
Yeah, this is where I think, I mean, Brexit sucked up a lot of political energy, whichever way you came up on that side of the equation. And I think at times people on the Remain side thinks, because of Brexit, that is why, for example, we're seeing all of this situation in Northern Ireland and all of this kind of situation in Scotland in terms of potentially there being a unified island, and also, you know, Scotland kind of being independent, and therefore the UK is effectively broken up, which isn't, I don't think, there's an element of truth, but it's not entirely true. I think regardless of Britain, if we take Northern Ireland, for example, that was always going to be an issue, because sooner or later, for example, the Catholic population is currently on course to exceed that of the Protestant population. And that was going to happen regardless of whether Brexit happened or not. And so these kind of situations have been creeping up on the UK governments for quite a long time, but successive Westminster governments have made attempts at kind of resolving them, but have often, if they're such long-term issues, they've often been pushed to the long grass, but now they're coming up. So in terms of Northern Ireland, it's an incredibly historically difficult situation. The issue is that the hardliners in Northern Ireland, the DUP, and I shouldn't necessarily call them hardliners because their viewpoint is particularly popular, let's just say, within the unionist force. I don't think they'll ever kind of agree to that being a unified island. And then, well, if you've kind of got, for example, a Catholic majority, well, then if you want a rock and a hard place, it's hard to know how that situation would really revolve itself. And this is where, again, you need some sterling political leadership to kind of go and steer us through some very choppy waters. The troubles were not that long ago. Feelings still room extremely high. There was some trouble in Belfast just the other night as well. So perhaps, you know, in Northern Ireland, I can see two futures, one of it remaining within the UK, but having a special relationship, if you want, with the EU and Ireland. And the second one would be, if you want, Northern Ireland gradually becoming a bit more of an autonomous country between the two systems, between being, if you want, half in, half out of both systems, and therefore maintaining the peace and balance within those communities. In terms of my kind of personal viewpoint, if that's what has to happen, that's what has to happen. The most important thing looking at the Northern Ireland question is that that area remains peaceful and that both communities feel listened to. The danger happens when both communities become entrenched, and it simply becomes a question of you have to be part of Britain, you have to become fully part of Ireland as well. I do, and I know it won't be the most kind of popular opinion in parts of like Wales, England and Scotland, but I do think Northern Ireland is a special and unique situation. And so therefore it does require a special and unique solution as well, which just due to its kind of recent history and its wider history beyond that as well. In terms of Scotland as well, I think let's just wait and see. Let's just wait and see what happens in terms of the most recent election. I think if there is a nationalist majority, like I said, I don't see how a referendum can be prevented. But then the big question would be, when is that referendum going to happen? And this is where it'll be an interesting position for the UK government, because you could argue if it's a short-term referendum, you then have quite a lot of political ammunition to throw at the SNP in terms of them putting their own political aspirations above maybe the good of Scotland, and you can make that a winnable situation. The danger is of course, is that everything could fall apart in a new Brexit universe remarkably quickly. What they might go for is agreeing to more of a kind of long-term referendum, which will give them more time to think about things such as the future of the UK, more time for Britain to go untapped to something such as Brexit. Of course, there are fallbacks and there are all problems with that solution as well, but I think probably that is what the UK government would do in response to that as well. They might try and clap down and say no referendum, but then you get into all kinds of sticky situations. I don't think it would be the wisest solution to do. And then, sorry, I know I'm kind of rambling on, but it also probably will matter in terms of what is the size of this majority. If it's a really slender majority, then the UK government might have some grounds for trying to refuse it or very much push it to the back burner. If it's, as the nationalists call it, a super majority, then a referendum probably is inevitable. But nonetheless, just because there is a super majority and a referendum becomes inevitable, doesn't necessarily mean that Scotland will vote yes or no. There is still on that question everything to play for. But I do think Britain as a whole, whether you live in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, etc., there should be this fundamental debate now in terms of what is it that keeps the UK together, what makes us British, and how can we prosper as a whole. And that kind of discussion we haven't had enough of as a kind of union, and perhaps now it's time to kind of speak about it in those terms and actually answer the question in the 21st century: what does it actually mean to be British, and what does it mean to be part of the United Kingdom?
Okay, yeah. Well, so a lot of work to do on identity.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, I think we'll end this discussion on the union there. And
Lovely stuff.
Thanks for answering all the questions and in a very eloquent manner. And thanks to all the listeners.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Tom.